Hey kids, this is Ivan. This is the third installment of the Saving Throw series, if you will. I do apologize up front. This one's going to be a little long, but we've got a lot of stuff to cover, and it should be kind of interesting. Now, if you recall, in the very beginning, I said that there's kind of a shtick or a rationale of why different classes save the way they do. You know, the main attribute of fighters would be their toughness. That's how they're resisting all these various bad things. Clerics, on the other hand, well, they're a little tough because they're frontline combatant, but they've also got this divine intervention thing going on. Thieves, on the other hand, they've got this sixth sense, and just their reflexes are really good. They jump out of the way of stuff. Whereas magic users, their biggest attribute towards saves is just the fact that they're magical. They have arcane knowledge. They know what's going on. They have some magic resistance. Now, we'll start with magical saves. You can think of magic, like I said at the end of the second installment, as being divided into about 5 different parts. There's death magic. There's any kind of paralyzing magic. There's body-changing magic, like petrifaction and polymorph, where you're literally getting changed into something else. There's magic being shot out of an item, like, not a person, but like, rod, staff, wand, some kind of magic item. And there's all other spells. I'll start off with, first edition has a category called rod, staff, wand. I think this is one of the most ridiculous things in the world. I get why they have it, but, the idea is that you're better at saving versus an item than you are versus a spell cast by a person. But if you look at it, if you look at the tables, you'll realize that you save 1 better versus rod, staff, wand than you do versus spells, no matter what your class, no matter what level you are. So I think pretty much you can get rid of the category and just say, look, if you're saving versus something being shot out of a staff, just add 1 to your saving throw score and roll high, buddy, because you don't want to get hit by this. Now, Basic has its own little category called Magic Wands, and I think it's actually kind of a neat category, giving it a second look. I think the basic idea with this is it's kind of like getting shot by a gun. It's not so much like getting shot by a spell, and so you need to jump out of the way of this. Now, Basic doesn't have a dexterity modifier to any kind of reflex-based saves or reflex-based spells like First Edition does, so I think they're trying to get that same kind of vibe. If you look at the tables, you'll see that Thieves actually save 1 better versus Magic Wands than they do versus spells. They save versus both pretty well. They're able to jump out of the way of these things, pretty consistently through time. Now, Clerics and Fighters, on the other hand, they save about 2 or 3 better versus Magic Wands than they do versus spells. So it seems like they're a little bit better at jumping out of the way of something being shot out of a wand than they are out of, stopping some guy casting something at them. Magic users are totally backwards. They save worse versus magic wands than they do versus spells, which kind of still substantiates my little suspicion that it's a reflex thing. And even though it's magical, even though they save fairly well versus it, they're just not doing as well as they are versus saving versus spells that an actual person casts. So it's a little bit, like a gun. Now, I don't think you necessarily need to have this in your game, but yeah, I'm kind of considering it because it's kind of neat. It's a little thing where some guy just goes pop, and you better jump out of the way. And you save a little different, even though if you're a magic user, so you could have a different kind of save for that. Why is death magic in its own category? Well, 2 reasons. First of all, it's really nasty. It's going to kill you right out. Second thing is, I think the idea with this and some body changing magic, like I'll get into, is that you're resisting it more through just overall fortitude and toughness, and it's not so much just a magic thing or a magic resistance thing as you are just saying, no way is this going to happen to me, and you're just going to stop it. Now, you look at the other type of magic, the body-changing magic, the petrifaction and polymorph, and you look at the saves, how the classes go with that, and it kind of supports that same assumption. Fighters and clerics save a little bit better for body-affecting magic than they do versus spells, and they save a little bit better versus death magic than they do versus body-affecting magic. So I think it's a little progression there, where because of their fortitude, especially the fighter, they're just saving a little bit better, and the cleric, of course, gets the little kicker from divine intervention. Thieves, on the other hand, they save 1 better for body-affecting magic than they do versus death magic in First Edition, so it's backwards. And they save a little bit better versus those things than they do versus spells at the beginning. Now, as time goes on, they actually end up saving better versus spells than they do versus body-affecting magic or death magic. So I think that still supports the basic premise that those kind of magics are fortitude and toughness based. And even though the thief is good at dodging out of the way of things like spells, something that's going to affect his body or kill him, he's not progressing in that same kind of toughness the same way that like a fighter is and the same way a cleric is. To a lesser extent, and he doesn't have the cleric's divine intervention because the gods really don't like thieves for the most part. Magic users are totally backwards from fighters they save the absolute worst versus death magic, followed by body-changing magic, followed by spells where they save really, really well. And once again, I think that supports that basic premise that they're saving because of magical knowledge. So versus most spells, they're doing pretty well. Versus something where they really need to be tough, they're not doing so good because that's not their shtick. That's not their whole vibe for like why they save versus things. Now, poison saves pretty simple. Clerics save substantially better than everybody else, and I think it's mostly a divine intervention thing. And death magic gets lumped in there. They get that kicker for that. Fighters start out not saving so well, but they end up saving pretty good, and they progress fairly rapidly, like they do in most saves. And I think it's a little bit more of a toughness thing. It's just not going to affect me. Magic users and thieves start out pretty close to fighters, but they progress slower, and they just never get really all that high versus poison. And I think it's the same basic thing. They're not progressing in fortitude the same way the other classes are. They're not as tough. Now, breath weapons. Clerics do reasonably well against breath weapons the whole way up. They don't do that bad. Fighters start out about the worst, but they progress really rapidly, and they end up being about the best. And I think it's that whole tough thing. Go ahead, breathe on me, dragon. Is that the best you got? Thieves in first edition start out okay, but then they start to fall behind the cleric. Whereas in basic, they remain neck and neck with the cleric the whole way up. And I think the two games were operating with two different premises in terms of the breath weapon save for the thief. I think in basic they were going with the basic premise that he's jumping out of the way the whole time, and he's getting better and better and better at this. Whereas in first edition they were thinking of breath weapon as being partly reflex based, but partly just overall toughness based. And if you're not that tough, you're not going to progress that much. So that's why the thief doesn't progress that much versus breath weapons. I personally like the basic motif a little better, so I may switch to that for thieves in my game. Magic users actually start a little bit better than thieves and clerics versus breath weapons, and they continue to save pretty good versus breath weapons the whole time. And I think that's just because breath weapons are magical, and magic users rather have good saves versus magic. And so, there's something about the dragon breath that's a little arcane, a little crazy, and because of their magically goodness, they're able to save versus that relatively well. Well, that's it for today. I know it was kind of long, and we'll get on with the difficulties of the saves themselves next time. Thanks for hanging in.